Hello, my name is Olu Osha. I like talking about American presidents. I want to discuss three instances when corrupt bargains were said to have been struck in US presidential annals. Now, these corrupt bargains are normally associated with presidential elections or presidential transitions. Now, I use that qualifier, presidential transitions, because we will see the reason in the third instance. Now, the first instance of a corrupt bargain was during the presidential elections between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams, of course, was the son of uh, the second president, John Adams. And John Quincy Adams was a very brilliant man. He started working for his father at a very early age in his teens. His father actually employed him as his secretary during the Treaty of Paris. You know, he was about 16 years old, and so he also traveled extensively with his father in Europe when his father was a plenipotentiary ambassador to. He was minister plenipotentiary and ambassador. Minister plenipotentiary is a term they used. Um, so it's sort of like an ambassador, but you know, it's like when the nations are not at par or one nation is not really officially recognized. So minister plenipotentiary was what was the title that was used then, and so he was minister to France, and Britain and Russia, and where else? Holland. So John Quincy Adams traveled extensively with his father, and so he spoke many languages. He was very fluent in these languages: German, French, Russian, Dutch. He was extremely fluent in a number of languages. So John Quincy Adams is routinely ranked as the president who had the highest IQ. He's said to have had an IQ of about 175. How did they get it? Well, I guess they use what's called hysterometrics. In any event, John Quincy Adams was very brilliant, very capable. He graduated from Harvard. He became an attorney, a lawyer, but he became a career diplomat, and so he was Secretary of State to President James Monroe. Um, his opponent was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson had been a major general. He had been a war hero. He had fought during the British, the war against the Brits in 1812, and he was also, rather notorious as a war hero during the wars against Native Americans. He had popular support. Now, it turns out that Andrew Jackson won the popular vote and the electoral vote, but he didn't get a majority. So he had a plurality, and so there was a 12th Amendment. The 12th Amendment meant they had to take the vote, the decision to the House of Representatives. Now, the contest was between four presidential candidates. This was the era of good feelings. Remember when I mentioned I'd done an earlier video in which I said during the era of good feelings, we had de facto one party system. The Democratic Republican Party was the dominant single party during that era. So all the presidential candidates came from the Democratic Republican Party. Um, so the top the contest was between Andrew Jackson, who had the plurality of the votes. He scored the highest. And then John Quincy Adams came second. Third was a guy called William Crawford. Fourth was Henry Clay. Henry Clay was Speaker of the House. Now, the 12th Amendment required that, okay, it goes to the House of Representatives, and then they make a decision between the top three contenders. Um, Henry Clay, who didn't like Andrew Jackson and whose doctrines, his philosophy were more aligned with John Quincy Adams' ideology, decided to send his followers and his votes to the camp of John Quincy Adams. So Henry Clay was also Speaker of the House, and so he convinced Congress, who decided the vote, convinced Congress to elect John Quincy Adams. So John Quincy Adams won, by decision by Congress. Soon after, John Quincy Adams would make Henry Clay Secretary of State. Back then, Secretary of State was a very important position. It was seen like a springboard to the presidency. If you notice that our first Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, would go on to become president himself. James Madison had been a Secretary of State. He became president himself. James Monroe had been Secretary of State. He became president himself. So back then, being a Secretary of State was seen sort of as a springboard to the presidency. So as a fallout, Andrew Jackson cried foul. Him and his followers, claimed that a corrupt bargain had been struck, and that was why he lost the vote, the presidency in the House of Congress. So that was the first instance of the corrupt bargain for the 1824 elections, which brought John Quincy Adams the presidency, made him our sixth president through the vote of Congress, when the Speaker of the House had actually thrown his support behind John Quincy Adams, and he'd been rewarded, it appeared, with the Secretary of State position. The second instance was during the elections of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden, who was governor of New York. Rutherford B. Hayes was another man who he graduated from Harvard Law School. He'd been a major general during the Civil War. He had been an advocate, passionate advocate for the civil rights. He was a Republican, and his opponent was a Democrat. Of course, during this era, that was when the Reconstruction era, Reconstruction era amendments had been passed, and there was the drive to actually sort of ensure that the civil rights of the newly freed slaves, were realized and protected. There were federal troops in the South, and the contest between Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes would end up with Rutherford B. Hayes behind. He was behind in the popular vote by a wide margin, and in electoral college votes he had 165 votes compared to Samuel Tilden's 184 votes. So a commission, it meant that Congress would set up a commission, right? There was a commission that was set up because there were contested votes in the South, in southern states, in South Carolina, in Florida, and Louisiana, and one electoral vote in the state of Oregon. Now, the southern states, there were black voters, right? And the Republican Party, they alleged that they should have won the southern states because of the black voters there, right? Remember, there was a 15th Amendment which gave black voters, which allowed black men to vote. But there was substantial fraud, right? And so the votes in South Carolina and Florida and Louisiana, they were heavily contested. And with the one vote in Oregon, all of these had 20 votes, 20 electoral votes that were up for grabs. So 20 electoral votes were in dispute. They decided to set up a commission to decide what the outcome of the elections would be. So the commission was made up of 5 congressmen, 5 senators, and 5 Supreme Court justices. The vote, so that was 15. Eventually, the votes were split 8-7. 8 Republicans voting for Rutherford B. Hayes, 7 Democrats voting for Samuel Tilden, which meant that Rutherford B. Hayes ended up winning the presidency. However, the camp of Rutherford B. Hayes has spoken with, they had negotiations with the Southern Democrats, that the Southern Democrats would not block the count and they would accept his presidency, right, if this was a bargain, this was a compromise, if Rutherford B. Hayes agreed to pull out federal troops from the South. The federal troops were there to enforce the Civil Rights Act of 1875 and, the 15th Amendment, which gave black men the votes, and, protect the rights of the newly freed black Americans in the South. However, this Southern Democrats, the whites in the South, they saw this as sort of humiliating, and of course they'd resisted the federal troops. So in exchange for accepting the presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes, the Southern Democrats struck a deal with Rutherford B. Hayes that Rutherford B. Hayes would remove the federal troops, which would end Reconstruction and abandon the civil rights, the fight for the civil rights of black Americans. So this happened, and Rutherford B. Hayes was elected as president in 1877 by the Commission, and of course civil rights were, for black Americans was abandoned, and white supremacy was institutionalized in the South. Jim Crow laws were institutionalized, and this, blacks were removed from public office, and all the moves by well-meaning Southerners to end, or to actually to end discrimination and seek and advance the civil rights and equality of black people were basically terminated. In Virginia, there had been this party called the Readjuster Party. It was a biracial party. When I say biracial, it consisted of blacks and whites, and they were working together. And one of their goals was to actually fund black teachers, and who could advance, the educational development of the newly freed black people in Virginia. And so all attempts at equality, ended with a compromise of 1877, which was called the Second Corrupt Bargain. And, the civil rights of black Americans were basically abandoned for Jim Crow laws and white supremacy in the South. Now, the third instance of a corrupt bargain, this didn't involve elections. This was with the Watergate scandal during the second term of President Richard Nixon. Everybody knows the scandal, the presidential, scandal during the Watergate scandal, but people don't often talk about the scandal with the vice presidency. So the first vice president that Nixon had was Spiro Agnew. He had actually been a governor in Maryland, from the state of Maryland, but he was involved in a corruption scandal which forced him to resign, and a congressman, Gerald Ford, was subsequently picked as his replacement by Nixon. And so unfortunately, shortly after, or around the same time, Nixon was embroiled in his own scandal as well, with the Watergate incident, where he'd used spies to break in and burglarize the Democratic offices so he could get some kind of dirt on them for the presidency, which ironically he went on to win in a landslide. But so there were investigations going on, and it was becoming very clear that Nixon was going to be impeached, and so he decided to resign. So he's the only president that's ever resigned. And but it is said that he struck a deal with with Gerald Ford, who replaced him, and Gerald Ford decided that he would not he would not. He gave him assurances that he would not prosecute him, and so he pardoned Nixon when Nixon resigned and Gerald Ford succeeded him as president. And so that's a third instance when it is said that a corrupt bargain was struck in U.S. presidential history. Now, my name is Olu Osha. I like talking about American presidents because it is interesting. It is I've always found it interesting. I studied U.S. presidents since I was a kid in Nigeria, and of course, as an American citizen, and I have a law degree and I have degrees in history, I continue to study U.S. presidents, and that's a good way to actually understand not just our politics, but our country and how we're still a work in progress and how we've evolved. Each time we study the U.S. presidents, and we learn about their ups and downs, their strengths, their weaknesses. We learn more about U.S. history and about leadership as well. I also draw attention to color of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the court that I've been suffering in Montgomery County, Maryland, in order to impede, to obstruct justice. My name is Olu Osha. Again, I'll keep you posted. Thank you.